At the age of 13, he watched his father poisoned, his family hunted, and his people enslaved. By 30, he ruled an empire larger than Rome. His name struck terror across continents. This is how a boy born to nothing became the most ruthless conqueror the world has ever known. Across the cold, open, windswept plains of 12th century Mongolia, where survival was a daily war and the horse was not just transportation, but lifeblood, a child was born beneath a sky that seemed endless. His name was Temujin. There was no palace, no silk-lined cradle, only the raw earth, biting winds, and the belief that this child was destined for greatness or ruin. His birth was marked not by celebration, but by omen, while legends came later, coloring his arrival. With prophecy and foretelling, the reality was far less romantic. It was a life into hardship, born to a chief of a small tribe at a time when clan loyalty was always fragile and betrayal lingered behind every alliance. The Mongol steppes were an unforgiving world. Tribes spent centuries in endless cycles of war, revenge, horse theft, enslavement, and seasonal survival. Life was tribal, violent, and based on strength. To gain power was to hold control with both fear and respect. Temujin's tribe, the Borjigin, were respected for their lineage, but were not untouchable. His father, Yasuge, a hardened Khan and warrior, had once unified several clans under his command through warfare and diplomacy. But no one's grip on power in the steppes was permanent. When Temujin was just 9 years old, his life took a violent and permanent detour. Yasuge was returning home after arranging a marriage for the young boy, but on the way, he was secretly poisoned by rival Tatars, age-old enemies who had smiled with false peace. He died in agony, never reaching home. His death created a power vacuum that shattered Temujin's world. With no strong leader in their midst, Temujin's tribe, people who once bowed to his father, turned their backs on the widow and the children. Almost overnight, the family became outcasts. Without the protection of the clan, Temujin, his mother, Hailun, and his siblings were left to survive in the wilderness, banished from even the limited resources of the tribe they once called their own. They lived off scraps, digging edible roots from frozen soil, eating wild rodents, sometimes birds. They could trap. Temujin learned what hunger meant, not just the kind that gnawed at the stomach, but the type that shaped his worldview. The world was not fair. There were no guarantees of loyalty or even pity. Some nights young Temujin sat beside his mother and listened to her stories of their ancestors, of warriors who rode before dawn and claimed the sky, of men who turned hardship into history. She refused to let them believe they were broken, even when their clothes were tattered and their bones visible through thinning skin. This woman, Hailun, would become a quiet force behind Temujin's resolve. She was a proud woman, once kidnapped herself by Temujin's father in a tribal raid, and now abandoned with his children in exile. But she would not teach them to weep. She taught them to wait, to endure, and to remember. But isolation imposed not just survival, it imposed danger. Other tribes hunted them. Wild animals stalked their makeshift homes. Even among his own brothers, conflict brewed. When food was scarce and tempers short, violence became inevitable. One of the most defining dark moments of Temujin's youth was not at the hands of an outsider, but from within his own family. His half-brother Bekta hoarded food and tried to assert dominance over the family. In a calculated, frigid act of survival and rebellion, Temujin took his bow and struck down Bekta, his own blood. A murder, yes, but one that, in his mind, ensured the family's survival. Already Temujin was not merely reacting, he was deciding. Not with impulse, but clarity. This was no ordinary boy. By his early teens, Temujin had already tasted betrayal, exile, hunger, and fratricide. But it didn't stop there. For a brief period, he and his younger brother were kidnapped and enslaved by a rival Mongol clan. Tied. Like dogs, he spent days under guard, barely fed. Most boys would have been broken then, scarred for life. But Temujin observed, planned, and manipulated. A loophole opened one night. A sympathetic guard disapproved of his suffering. Temujin used both submission and persuasion to gain his trust. When the guard eventually released him, Temujin escaped into the cold night and never looked back. That escape didn't just restore his freedom. It ignited something dangerous. It proved to Temujin that power didn't have to come from inheritance. It came through will, through strategy, through fear when necessary and persuasion when possible. Individuals mattered more than bloodlines. This thinking would set Temujin apart for the rest of his life. He returned to his mother shortly after. But the boy who had left was no longer a boy. What re-entered the camp was someone transformed. A young mind forged under immense pressure, bearing no illusions about the world, but harboring a growing belief. If he could control fear, his own, and that of others, he could control fate itself, and perhaps even the steps. As Temujin entered adolescence, something remarkable happened. Amid the chaos of exile and trauma, he began to inspire loyalty. Not through bribes or noble birth, he had none, but through raw conviction and merit. Young outcasts, hunters, wanderers, even former enemies began to gravitate toward this teenager, who didn't seem bound by the laws of their brutal world. He didn't fear stronger clans, he didn't flinch at hardship, and more importantly, he didn't forget kindness or betrayal. Each act etched itself into his growing system of justice. For those who helped him during his time in the wilderness, he would reward beyond their expectations in the years to come. And for those who wronged him, he would set an example. It was during this time that one of the most crucial relationships of his life blossomed. A boy from another clan, Jamuka, became his blood brother. An oath deeper than friendship, the two dreamed not just of surviving, but of uniting the endless warring tribes of the steppe into something greater. Together, they rode, hunted, and swore allegiance to each other. For a time, they were inseparable, two minds with one shared heartbeat, destiny. But as fire forges metal, time and ambition would soon test them in ways neither foresaw. Loyalty was sacred to Temujin, but so was strength. Despite being barely into his teen years, Temujin's leadership instincts matured rapidly. He began to study clan politics, intermarriages, merchant routes, sacred customs, and how vengeance operated like currency in the steppe. He understood that offensive war was costly, but fear could achieve the same ends. Most boys his age were still learning to ride effectively. Temujin was studying influence. He also found love in this transitional stage of his journey. His marriage to Berta, a girl from another tribe, was more than just a personal bond, it was political. Temujin understood even then the power of alliances. Berta would become more than his wife. She was a queen in the making and a pillar of his later empire. But no Mongol story is safe from war. Shortly after their marriage, Berta was kidnapped by the Merkits, a powerful rival tribe. Temujin, still a young man and far from an established leader, did not hesitate. He formed an alliance with his blood brother Jamuka and another clan chief. Together, they launched a raid, devastated the enemy, and rescued Berta. Her return wasn't just a personal victory, it was a message. No one could take what Temujin loved and live. Each event stacked like bricks in the rising walls of his destiny. From starving child to a tactician of vengeance and alliances, from outcast hunted like prey to the man forming raiding parties capable of routing full tribal factions. The boy who once scavenged animal bones now had the eyes of warriors on him. Some to follow, some to fear. By age 16, the orphaned, exiled, barefooted boy was now a rising wolf among sheep-trained clans. And yet he wasn't just chasing revenge. Others could be satisfied with reclaiming tribal pride or punishing past betrayers. Temujin was envisioning something far riskier, far grander. He wanted unity, real unity. A single people forged by merit, loyalty and strength. But that dream was radical. On the steppes, decentralization was law. Every clan had its own leaders, bloodlines were sacred, and tradition ruled over efficiency. Temujin's emerging philosophy, that leadership should depend on ability, not birthright, was both threatening and revolutionary. He respected tradition, yes, but only as much as it served survival. Anything else was baggage. Old roots had to be burned for a fire to grow. As the wind howled across the great Mongolian land, few could see what was coming. But among the wolves and horses, one boy stood apart. Hardened by betrayal, sculpted by suffering, already tempered by justice and vengeance, Temujin's time had begun. He would carry the orphan's hunger not in his stomach now, but in his soul. And that hunger, one day, would devour empires. In a land where betrayal was more common than rain, friendships were not just rare, they were revolutionary. Among the many relationships that would shape Temujin's destiny, none was more profound, more intimate, or more tragic than his bond with Jamuka. The two met as boys riding under the same sky, chasing the same dreams. Their paths crossed in a time when neither commanded armies, when the echo of hoofbeats did not yet strike fear, and when ambition still rode quietly beside loyalty. From the moment they met, there was an unspoken recognition. Both possessed sharp minds, deep hunger, and the rare ability to see the world not just as it was, but as it could be. They found in each other what the steppes seldom offered: trust. And so they performed the sacred Mongol ritual of Anda, becoming blood brothers. This was more than friendship. It was a vow deeper than tribal law, a spiritual bond declaring that they were one soul in two bodies. For a time, it was true. Side by side, they rode across plains lit by the rising sun, talking not just about battles or herds, but about uniting the broken world around them. Temujin, son of an assassinated chief, and Jamuka, noble-born and well-connected. Together, they were young flames fed by vision, and each was the wind to the other's fire. They learned fast. In a world where alliances were temporary and life ended beneath steel, both boys immersed themselves in the reality of tribal politics. While still in their teens, they both began forming small coalitions, bands of warriors, renegades, hunters, and freelancers disillusioned by the corruption of tribal elites. These were not armies yet, but they were the beginning of something greater. Every raid they led, every camp they conquered, was a stepping stone. Temujin especially began attracting a unique kind of follower, not the aristocrats but the overlooked. Slaves released from other tribes, subject peoples with no inheritance, loyal fighters with no title. To him their greatness lay not in birth, but ability. To Jamuka, still rooted in aristocratic tradition, this was odd. At this stage, their differences were subtle. Jamuka was charismatic, eloquent in Mongol custom, and more respected among traditional leaders. Temujin was more unorthodox, blunt, ruthless when required, but fiercely loyal to anyone loyal to him. Each complemented the other, but within that balance lurked a shadow. For in all of history, very few friendships survive a single dangerous truth that one must eventually lead. And they both knew it. As their followings grew, so did the whispers. Who would command? Who would one day unite the steppes? Temujin remained grounded in a principle that was radical for his time. Loyalty was sacred, but it should never override ability. And with this belief, he began making decisions that quietly drew ideological lines between him and Jamuka. One of his earliest and most telling moves was to promote warriors purely on merit, peasants over princes, cooks over commanders, if they had proven themselves. He once elevated a common blacksmith to lead a raiding party, saying, "He strikes iron like thunder. Let him strike men the same." To tribal elites, this was blasphemy. To the lower classes, it was revelation. Jamuka began to feel the difference and the distance. He was not envious, but wary. Where Temujin welcomed change, Jamuka upheld tradition. Where Temujin drew in the desperate and dispossessed, Jamuka listened to nobles and elders. Though they still shared campfires and spoke of unity, their eyes had begun scanning different horizons. Temujin saw an empire of equals in discipline. Jamuka saw a throne balanced on the laws of old. Then came one of the earliest, but most emotionally loaded clashes of ideology. In a moment that would foreshadow the coming rift, Temujin began defending and offering refuge to lower-class refugees from other clans. People Jamuka believed should be returned to their masters if peace were to last, but Temujin declined. A man who flees chains should not be given back to them, he said. It was a line drawn in the steppes. Still, both men remembered the oath. Still, they rode together. For now. As Temujin grew into a more assertive leader, the seeds of division quietly bloomed into thorns. His following swelled, not with nobles or royals, but with the voiceless, the broken, and the brave. Farmers turned warriors, orphans in search of a name, commoners who had long suffered the yoke of elite families. Temujin became more than a commander. He became a symbol. To the outcasts of the steppe, he was not just hope. He was change. Meanwhile, Jamuka's camp began twisting with doubt. He saw Temujin breaking norms, dismantling centuries-old prestige, and disrupting the quiet rhythm of aristocratic power. And as more warriors defected to Temujin, enticed by meritocracy and his unwavering code of loyalty, Jamuka began to feel what no Anda ever should: competition. The final blow came when Temujin declared himself Khan of the Mongols, a unifier not just of tribes but of ideals. It wasn't just a political declaration. It was a challenge to every traditional title, and by extension a challenge to Jamuka himself. With that act, the friendship once forged in blood cracked in open daylight. Jamuka gathered his forces, comprised mostly of noble families and veteran warriors. Temujin marshaled his army, smaller but forged in hardship, loyalty, and reform. The civil war between the brothers had begun. The first battle between them would be a brutal reckoning, the Battle of Dalan Baljut. Though outnumbered, Temujin's forces, loyal and strategically precise, shocked Jamuka's elite-led armies. They held the field, even pushed back superior cavalry units. But ultimately, Temujin withdrew strategically, learning from every flaw exposed in battle. Jamuka, triumphant, did not celebrate with grace. In a horrifying act meant to assert dominance and send a warning, he captured 70 of Temujin's warriors and boiled them alive. This was not just war, it was psychological annihilation. Temujin was not just to be defeated, he was to be erased, and yet he wasn't. In the silence after the massacre, Temujin swore a vow. He would never be weakened by mercy again. This was not just the betrayal of a blood brother. It was the moment childhood dreams turned to ashes, and ambition crystallized into destiny. The civil war between Temujin and Jamuka would stretch beyond that first battle, years soaked in betrayal, shifting alliances, and painful memories. But it was in that crucible that Temujin's philosophy hardened. The world was not one with sentiment. It was one with structure, loyalty, and fear. Later, when Temujin finally defeated Jamuka in a stunning reversal of power, he captured his childhood friend, his blood brother, the one who once rode beside him and dreamed the same dream. And here the emotional weight converged on one final moment. Temujin could have tortured him, paraded him, or executed him in the same horror Jamuka once unleashed. Instead, he asked his oldest friend, "Would you join me again and help me make a world?" Jamuka refused, not because he didn't believe, but because he knew his mere existence would weaken that world. He said, "There is room for only one sun in the sky." Temujin wept. And then, respectfully, he granted Jamuka a noble death, a swift one. The story of Temujin and Jamuka is perhaps the most human within the legend of Genghis Khan. Two boys, born into the same chaos, grasping the same dream. And yet, one chose the world that was. The other chose the world that could be. Their bond, shattered by ambition, left a scar on the soul of Temujin that never fully healed. It taught him that love must serve loyalty or be sacrificed to it. Their friendship did not survive ambition, but it gave birth to an empire. The steppe demanded survival, and Temujin had mastered it. But now, he faced a far more dangerous pursuit: conquest. From a hunted orphan to a rising leader with a growing band of fiercely loyal followers, Temujin stood on the edge of transformation, not just of himself, but of an entire world. The first spark came from something personal, something primal: love. When his wife Berta was kidnapped by the Merkits, an old rival tribe, Temujin didn't hesitate. He had not yet been declared a Khan, nor did he have a vast army. But his loyalty was absolute, and so was his rage. He pooled his alliances, including Togrul, the leader of the Karites, and Jamuka, his blood brother at that time, still on his side, and rode into battle. In a stunning raid, they slammed into Merkit territory like a storm on horseback. Swift, brutal, effective. Berta was rescued. More than a wife, she was a symbol now. A reason for vengeance, a reason for power, and part of what would eventually allow Temujin to claim a noble bloodline through her. But the battle did more than return his queen. It gave him clarity. Warfare wasn't just survival, it was strategy. And Temujin was beginning to see a future far beyond revenge. The steppes of Mongolia had always been chaotic, a quilt of warring clans, intersecting blood feuds, and shifting loyalties. No tribe stayed loyal forever. No peace treaty was eternal. It had been this way for generations. Temujin began to question why. Why couldn't there be order? Why must every spring bring a new war? Why should power be based on birth and not ability? These questions burned in him, and with every clan he defeated, he tested his answers in real time. Traditional Mongol warfare was loose, fluid, driven by personal valor and noble status. Temujin shattered that model. He implemented what no warlord before him had attempted: discipline. Under his command, orders were followed exactly. Loot was distributed by rule, not preference. Acts of insubordination were punished swiftly. Even generals were held accountable. If a commander defied orders, even with victory, he might be executed. Why? Because Temujin knew that chaos, even in success, leads to collapse. He began to build a war machine, not a temporary band of raiders, but something greater, something permanent, and at its core was merit. A herdsman could become a commander, a slave could rise. What mattered was loyalty to Temujin and performance in battle. One of his most trusted generals, Subutai, would later lead armies into Europe. Not because he was noble, but because he was genius. Temujin believed in using the right hand, not the noble hand. And it worked. His armies began to win consistently. And unlike other Khans who abandoned allies once their purpose ended, Temujin never forgot gratitude. This created a ripple of loyalty across the steppes. But it wasn't just his battlefield innovations that turned heads, it was his vision. After his rift with Jamuka deepened and their civil war intensified, Temujin did something that stunned the tribal system. He codified law. He implemented justice that even he had to obey. Stealing horses, lying, adultery, murder. Each was now met with clear-cut consequences. Unlike the fluid and vengeful justice of the past, based on revenge and bribes, Temujin's system brought predictability, fairness, and fear. The people noticed, and more importantly, they followed. Disenfranchised clans, merchant families, escaped slaves, they began riding under his banner, no longer because of geography or birth, but because of belief. By the time Temujin was in his late 30s, the steppe was beginning to change. Tribal customs were still strong, but among the central lands his influence was undeniable. Every skirmish, every rescued hostage, every decisive victory brought more clans to his side and forced others into submission. Yet for a man who had once survived by hiding in the grass and eating rodents, the question now loomed larger than ever. What do you do with success when survival is no longer your only goal? The answer came in 1206. On the banks of the Onon River, after nearly 2 decades of battle, loss, betrayal, and revolution, a council was called between all the Mongol tribes who now lived under Temujin's authority. This wasn't a quick military meeting. This was the Kurultai, a sacred gathering of Khans from every tribe to recognize not just a leader, but a sovereign. As Temujin stood among his people, the future shifted. He was no longer just Temujin the outcast, no longer the rebel breaking traditions from within. On that day, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, not Khan of a single tribe, not chieftain of one bloodline, but Khan of all the Mongols, the universal ruler. It was a title heavy with promise and born of transformation. For the first time in centuries, the endless mosaic of Mongol clans was unified, not just by name, but by common law, military discipline, and a vision larger than any pasture. But this unification was not comfortable. It was not soft. Genghis Khan still lived by a code forged in hardship. Dissent was crushed. Rebellions were extinguished before they could spark. And his central intelligence network, yes, a primitive spy system, kept him informed of betrayals before they happened. The elevation of Genghis Khan wasn't just a name change. It marked the beginning of an ideological shift unlike anything seen before in nomadic culture. Tribal thinking was based on revenge, kinship, and pride. But imperial thinking, it was built on permanence, infrastructure, law, expansion, philosophy. Genghis began building more than armies. He laid the groundwork for an empire that would disrupt and redefine the medieval world. He sent envoys to neighboring states. He mapped silk trade routes. He established relay systems between outposts for long-distance communication. And he began to think in years, not seasons. Yet Temujin never forgot where he came from. He maintained a Spartan lifestyle. No gold crowns, no elaborate robes. He dressed like his men, ate what they ate, rode as they rode. Everyone from soldier to ambassador saw in him not just a ruler, but a man molded by suffering, sharpened by years in the cold, and elevated by the very people that empires had long ignored. Genghis Khan brought justice to victims, order to chaos, and method to destruction. At the heart of it all lay a paradox. Brutal to his enemies, but just to his followers. Destroyer of cities, but builder of laws. The transformation was complete. The boy driven by vengeance had become a ruler driven by vision. With his authority, Fully established, Genghis Khan turned his gaze outward. The Mongol tribes had been united, yes, but unity was never his final goal. He believed that the same systems that brought order to the steppe, loyalty, discipline, justice, and fear, could reshape the world. But before any global conquest could begin, he needed to cement control at home. He reorganized the traditional clan system, shattering the foundations of hereditary aristocracy. Rival tribal identities were diluted. Men from different tribes were placed in the same military units, Arbans, Zun, Mingan. This forced loyalty to him over tribal bloodlines. His army was restructured into a decimal system. 10 men reported to a commander, and 10 of those reported to another above them. It was a simple, elegant design that brought order from centuries of chaos. An army that had once acted like a scattered swarm could now strike like a single organism. And most importantly, he tied every soldier's fate to empire-wide responsibility. If one man deserted in battle, the entire unit was punished. If one man disobeyed, all 10 paid the cost. It was harsh. Some called it inhumane, but it worked. It created the most disciplined force on horseback the world had ever seen. But Genghis did more than raise armies. He wrote rules for peace. He encouraged trade across regions, protected merchants who came under his banner, and ruthlessly attacked bandits who preyed on caravans. To him, commerce wasn't just profit. It was vital for securing loyalty across vast territory. Markets, after all, were easier to govern than ruins. In the process of redefining empire, Genghis Khan also redefined purpose. Survival had driven him as a boy. Revenge sculpted him as a youth. But now it was control, not out of pride, but necessity. He believed that only by controlling chaos could people truly live without fear. He had lived in fear once. He would never allow it again for himself or his people. But beneath the armor, the legacy, the title, there remained a piece of the boy who had scavenged beneath open skies, who had buried his half-brother with his own hands, who had once told his mother that one day he would never bow again. Now armies bowed to him. Khans trembled before they spoke his name. And the world had only just begun to feel the storm rising from Mongolia. Temujin was gone. The Khan had risen. Before Temujin was Genghis Khan, before the title, the banners, and the storms of conquest, he was a child who watched his father's murder go unanswered. A child cast into exile, told that power was everything, and without it, even justice was a myth. But now, power was his, and what had once been pain was now policy. What had once been injustice would now be repaid in full. Where others saw warfare as necessity, Genghis Khan saw it as reckoning. His first target would not be a distant kingdom or a foreign civilization, but a memory, unfinished business, rotting for years in the back of his mind like a poisoned wound. The Tatars. Years ago, they had broken bread with Temujin's father, Yesugei, then poisoned him by drink the same day. That act had led to the collapse of his family, his tribe's betrayal, his years in the wilderness. It had taken everything, and now Genghis Khan would take everything from them. In his mind, this was not war. It was judgment. He marshaled his forces with an exacting calculation. This would not be a symbol. it would be total annihilation. When the Mongol army swept into Tatar lands, it did so like a raw nerve of fury lashing across generations. They showed no distinction between warrior or noble, chief or elder. Every Tatar male taller than a cartwheel was executed. The rest, enslaved, scattered, erased. Their nobility, gone. Their name, crushed beneath the hooves of the people they once betrayed. This was not just vengeance, it was message. To betray Genghis Khan was not to die, but to ensure your grandchildren would never be born. But this campaign wasn't an outlier. It marked a new philosophy in Genghis Khan's life, from retribution to policy. He didn't merely want submission from his enemies, he wanted obliteration of their ability to imagine resistance. He had learned that mercy often invited treachery, and in the bloody tapestry of the steppes, treachery was a currency everyone trafficked in. So he created a new economy, one based on terror. Enter psychological warfare. He understood that the fear of Mongols often outran the Mongols themselves. Cities would collapse before the first arrows flew. He weaponized his reputation like fire, spreading it with survivors who were allowed to escape, or with enemy soldiers who deserted and carried with them the images of what they'd seen. During the siege of Nishapur, after one of his sons-in-law was killed in battle, Genghis ordered the complete extermination of its population. Some accounts claim hundreds of thousands were slaughtered. Others say more. The result was the same: panic across the region. As city after city heard of what had befallen their neighbors, many surrendered in advance, hoping tribute might protect them from annihilation. It rarely did. And yet, this ruthlessness was never aimless. It wasn't chaos or cruelty for sport. It was policy, which might be more terrifying. Genghis Khan wasn't mad. He was cold, logical. He punished betrayal with unimaginable force, but rewarded loyalty with unflinching generosity. Those who joined him were placed in high ranks, integrated into his military, and their faith was repaid tenfold. Farmers were spared, scholars employed, engineers protected if they submitted. If they did not, the sword answered. This binary morality governed his every campaign. Total loyalty or total destruction. Ambassadors killed, retaliation with fire, envoys mistreated, war. Disobedience wasn't an insult, it was grounds for extinction. His obsession with loyalty could be traced back to the early traumas still pulsing in his memory. From his own tribe abandoning him as a boy, to his blood brother Jamukha's betrayal, to the guards who once enslaved him, Genghis had come to believe in a world where only absolute compliance ensured stability. He did not ask for agreement. He demanded obedience, because in a lifetime of betrayals, loyalty was the only currency he could trust. This ethos shaped even his own people's fate. His generals, no matter how successful, were judged not by results, but by obedience. One of his most skilled commanders once disobeyed a tactical order in pursuit of a swifter victory. He returned to camp triumphant. Genghis had him executed and promoted his second in command, who had remained within the line of command. Victory meant nothing if it undermined discipline. To the outside world, this was cruelty. To Genghis Khan, it was justice. Cities could be rebuilt, Armies reformed, but fear carved itself into memory. Genghis Khan did not just want to overpower his enemies, he wanted to haunt them. Burn one city and a dozen would fold in fear. Execute one noble family and entire dynasties would abandon their thrones. The sword in his hand was more than a weapon. It was a message, written in blood across the veins of Asia. But this trauma-driven ruthlessness wasn't confined to enemies. Genghis imposed it inward too, on his kin, his council, even his own pride. When one of his own sons disrespected a general in front of the army, Genghis punished him, publicly. No one stood above the law, not even blood. That was the key to his power. He didn't merely rule with might. He engineered certainty. His people didn't wonder what would happen if they failed him. They knew. And yet beneath this terrifying facade, a question lingered. A shadow even the Khan could not slay. Had the line between justice and vengeance blurred? Or worse, had it disappeared altogether? For Genghis, raised in betrayal, sharpened. In desperation, the answer no longer mattered, because vengeance too had its own silence. Every conquered city, every slaughtered army, every chain of command purified by fear, brought with it the illusion of control, and control for Genghis was life's only assurance. Let others rule through diplomacy. Genghis ruled through certainty. But this approach carved scars into the world, scars that centuries later can still be traced. Historians still debate the death tolls, the erased kingdoms, the vanished bloodlines, the leveled cities. Entire populations vanished, cultures extinguished, others absorbed into the growing Mongol machine but altered forever. And yet, many of the men who rode beside him spoke of his loyalty, his generosity, his ability to weep with those he conquered, if they submitted. They didn't serve a bloodthirsty tyrant. They served someone who understood that peace can be more cruel than war, because peace in chaos is often a lie. The trauma that forged Genghis Khan also forged his policies. He didn't invent cruelty. He refined it into law. His punishments weren't random. They were structured, calculated, repeatable. Betrayal meant death, not because he enjoyed killing, but because he could not afford repeat lessons. He would rather burn a city today than risk insurrection tomorrow. So many of his campaigns blurred the line between strategy and massacre, between justice and vengeance. And at their core sat a man who, as a child, had once begged to be spared, who had once lived in the shadows of fear, powerlessness, and starvation. Now that boy had become the terror that haunted others. The same child who wept over his father's grave was now burying empires. Across his rise, one constant remained. Submission brought mercy. Resistance brought memory in the form of fire. So ask yourself, when justice becomes vengeance and vengeance becomes law, what remains of the soul? To Genghis Khan, perhaps that question never mattered, because in a world where survival had once been his only dream, he had now achieved something far greater. He had become judgment itself. For most of history, empires were built on conquest and crumbled under chaos. But Genghis Khan defied that trajectory. He believed that true power wasn't found in endless war. It was found in order. For a man who had drowned nations in blood, and crushed dynasties beneath hoof and steel, you might expect madness around every corner. But what shocked the world wasn't just his brutality, it was his belief in systems. And not just systems of dominance, but of fairness, efficiency, and law. The laws he created didn't just hold together a tribal confederation. They laid the foundation of the largest contiguous empire in human history, and they were known simply as the Yasa. The Yasa was oral, never carved in stone, never sealed with wax, but its presence was absolute. To defy it wasn't a legal issue, it was capital. This was Genghis's law code, a framework that combined the wisdom of steppe tradition, the ferocity of wartime necessity, and the sharp equity born of a man who once lived with nothing. The Yasa prescribed stiff penalties, execution for theft, torture for espionage, death for deserters. But interwoven between the grim punishments were principles of surprising modernity. Genghis outlawed the kidnapping of women, protected the rights of widows and orphans, appointed women as advisors or regents in the absence of men, and demanded religious tolerance across his empire. In a world where most empires forced gods upon the conquered, Genghis allowed all to pray freely, provided they obeyed the state. It wasn't that he was liberal. He was pragmatic. He understood that empires fell when they disrespected the beliefs of the governed, and so under penalty of death, Mongol soldiers were forbidden from mocking other religions. Buddhist monks, Muslim imams, Christian priests, Taoist sages, all were protected. Genghis himself never picked one path. He consulted shamans, spoke with scholars from multiple faiths, and punished only those whose religions interfered with unity. Another lesser-known but radical element under the Yasa was tax reform. Many nomadic or semi-nomadic societies had no overarching tax regulation before him, relying mostly on tribute or opportunistic looting. Genghis formalized taxes, but made them predictable. Merchants especially were elevated. They paid protection fees, yes, but in return, they were granted security across thousands of miles. His empire established what would become one of the most protected and vibrant long-distance trade networks of the medieval world. In time, the Silk Road flowered under Mongol protection, not in spite of their ruthlessness, but because of it. Bandits feared Mongol reprisal more than death itself. And so trade caravans filled with silk, silver, glass, spices, medicine, and ideas crossed untouched. That commerce, stimulated by policy, protected by law, and enforced by omnipresent fear, was one of Genghis's unspoken strategies. He didn't just conquer land. He conquered infrastructure without even building skyscrapers. He understood the bones of society were not made of pyramids and palaces. They were made of systemic order. So he created logistical machines behind the chaos of war. Rapid horse relays, called the Yam, were placed across the empire, providing intelligence couriers with fresh mounts every few miles. These riders could deliver orders, military intel, tax documents, or even royal correspondence at unimaginable speed. At their peak, these Mongol couriers moved with such velocity that one could travel hundreds of kilometers in a day, long before the world dreamed of motors or wires. He innovated not just with horses and laws, but with minds. Contrary to the image of the sword-obsessed barbarian, Genghis was obsessed with information. He understood better than many kings of his age that knowledge wins wars before they start. His use of reconnaissance teams, captured enemy officers, local defectors, and multilingual spies was unprecedented. Before attacking an empire, he'd send envoys dressed as traders to learn the terrain, the weaknesses, guard rotation patterns, political rivalries. Once, ahead of his invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, he sent a diplomatic caravan accompanied by scouts disguised as merchants, not to negotiate, but to observe. They returned with enough detail to map assault paths on cities hundreds of miles across enemy borders. The plan was laid before the first sword was drawn, but perhaps the greatest tool Genghis used in both governance and conquest was a simple principle: meritocracy. Gone were the days when noble birth guaranteed command. In the hierarchy of Genghis's armies, blood meant nothing without ability. The son of a goat herder could rise to command 10,000 men, if he earned it. Cowards were dismissed. Obedient, fighters were promoted. Unshakable loyalty, discipline under fire, and openness to strategy became the new currency. It wasn't just an ethical reform, it was efficient. His system rewarded effectiveness, and that made his war machine one of the most adaptable, intelligent, and responsive forces in history. This ruthlessly fair system was reflected in everyday life too. Laws were consistent, punishments were expected. Disobedience, whether from a soldier, governor, or cousin, was not just disapproved of, it was eliminated. For many who lived under his rule, especially those who were peasants, merchants, craftspeople, or border clans, he brought something no warlord had delivered before: order. Predictable, stable, and harsh, yes, but governed. Cities that swore loyalty and paid taxes were often left to govern themselves. Local laws were respected. What mattered to Genghis was allegiance, tax flow, and non-resistance. He governed like he waged war, efficiently. And from this paradox emerged a contradiction that the modern world still struggles with. Can great cruelty and great order coexist? To understand the full impact of Genghis Khan's code, you must first understand his intent. He wasn't shaping law to please philosophers or monks. He was attempting something far more difficult: crafting a system that could hold together dozens of cultural identities, hundreds of languages, and thousands of cities, villages, and mobile tribes under a single functioning command. The scale of his empire was unprecedented. So was his attempt to unite it with rules instead of constant repression. But make no mistake, the consequences for breaking those rules were irreversible. The Yasa did not evolve through debate or democracy. It was passed down like whispered commandments written into the memory of marshals, elders, scribes, and imperial administrators. Some say it began with simple mandates: protect the weak, obey orders, respect rank, but over time became a living organism. It included bizarre sections too: laws against washing clothes in running water, marriage regulations, even codes for how to eat meat communally in camps. It controlled life on levels most modern governments couldn't imagine. And yet, it worked. This rigor extended even to matters of succession and royal administration. Most empires tore themselves apart after the death of a great ruler. Civil war assassinations fractured provinces, but Genghis Khan had the foresight to plan ahead. He drafted inheritance systems, creating clear lines of succession among his sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui. Though envy festered beneath the surface, his structure prevented outright collapse after his death. Ogedei would eventually succeed him, largely due to this legal clarity. But Genghis understood that civilization wasn't built by laws alone. It required integration. So he didn't burn every city. He often spared engineers, artisans, and architects. He relocated them across the empire, creating an exchange of knowledge faster and vaster than any university or church might allow. A Persian builder might design siege weapons for Mongol armies hitting a Chinese city. A Chinese medical scholar might be relocated to Samarkand to help with plague control. Through forced dispersal, Genghis unwittingly created a neural network of cultural connectivity. It was brutal, but it was brilliant. Throughout his policies emerges a pattern: efficiency over emotion. He didn't kill because he enjoyed killing. He punished because fear upheld order, and order upheld legacy. He didn't protect religion because he was devout. He protected it because respect created loyalty across cultural lines better than fire ever could. He let people live where possible, but they had to live under his logic, not their own. And the innovations didn't stop at the battlefield or courtyard. Genghis's empire had diplomatic networks that predated modern embassies. His envoys, protected under strict Yasa privilege, were not to be harmed, ever. When the Khwarezmian Shah brutally executed one Mongol ambassador and shaved the beards of others, an unforgivable insult, Genghis responded not with negotiation. He responded with annihilation. 20 cities were flattened, over 1 million people gone. For the Khan, international protocol wasn't a game, it was sacred. Violate his diplomats, and he would send cavalry so large they'd block out the horizon. Even his military logistics reflected bureaucratic brilliance. Soldiers carried multiple horses to maintain speed. Camps were divided with military precision. Rations were conserved, and water sources were mapped as strategically as enemy troop positions. Training drills were relentless. Entire phalanxes trained in false retreats, the infamous Mongol withdrawal trap, where entire armies faked defeat to lure enemies into open fields before turning around to unleash their full assault. Brutality may have been the surface, but underneath, order reigned supreme. And in that order, something rare emerged: predictability. Even in a life marked by war, people under Mongol protection often had more consistent security, lower taxes, and greater religious freedom than under regional kings or sultans. Mongol markets were patrolled, travel was monitored, and laws were executed without favoritism. If a Mongol noble killed a merchant while drunk, he could be sentenced to death. Theft was punished publicly. Desertion was unforgivable. The law was sharp, but fair if you followed it. And yet, and through it all, a paradox deepened. Here was a man whose armies had drowned cities in blood. A man whose very name made kings abandon forts and peasants flee in terror. And yet, within the ashes of destruction, he planted the seeds of structure, continuity, and order. In his shadow, peace bloomed, not because he was gentle, but because he built a world where law replaced chaos, whether enforced by sword or scrolls it held. So the question lingers like smoke over a burned city. Can great cruelty and great order coexist? History's lens is still clouded. Moral clarity doesn't come easy when examining a ruler like Genghis Khan. But if you strip away the carnage and listen to the mechanics behind his empire, you find more than just a warrior. You find a systems thinker, a cold, calculating architect of civilization who understood that empires are not made in conquest. They are made after it, by rules, by vision, and by control. Others built temples. Genghis Khan built systems, and long after the temples fell, his system, brutal, precise, and strangely fair, survived. From the highlands of Mongolia to the very edges of the known world, the storm of Genghis Khan's ambition could no longer be contained. The steppe that had once tried to break him had become his war horse. Tribes were no longer rivals, they were his engine. The fractured pieces of his past had fused into one thunderous machine of conquest. But now, he would cast his eyes far beyond the steppes. The Mongol homeland was unified. That task was done. What lay ahead were nations, civilizations, kingdoms with walls and wealth, and one that made a fatal mistake, the Khwarezmian Empire. In the early 13th century, the Khwarezmian Empire sprawled across parts of modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Central Asia. Rich from trade and powerful with its standing army, it was ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, a monarch proud, paranoid, and deeply protective of his domain. He had never encountered the Mongols in full force, and like many of his time, he mistook their silence for insignificance. That would be his undoing. Genghis Khan, despite his projected barbarism, was not an enemy by default. He was strategic. He respected diplomacy when it benefited him, and in his early approach to the Khwarezmians sought trade, not war. He sent a caravan of merchants and ambassadors bearing fine gifts and formal letters of goodwill, offering trade routes, cultural exchange, and official recognition between the two powers. But in the Shah's court, Mongol intentions were viewed through a cynical lens. The diplomats were accused of spying, their goods seized, their bodies mutilated, and then executed. Genghis Khan did not weep. He did not retaliate with a raid or a warning. He summoned the wrath of nations. The murder of Mongol envoys was not just an insult. It was sacrilege. Under the Yasa, his sacred rule, the safety of ambassadors was inviolable. To violate that law was to invite obliteration. What followed wasn't a war. It was an eradication. In 1219, Genghis unleashed what would become one of the most devastating military campaigns in human history. He sent over 100,000 Mongol warriors, strategically divided into fast-moving columns, scout forces, main divisions, reserves. It wasn't merely the strength of numbers, it was their precision, their intelligence, and above all, their speed. Khwarezmian cities that had stood for centuries fell in mere days. Mongol arrows darkened skies before the first footstep was heard. They struck like ghosts. In many cases, entire cities didn't even have time to prepare defenses. By the time they lit their beacon fires, the Mongols were already inside the gates. Samarkand, Nishapur, Bukhara. Each of these historic jewels burned under the Mongol advance. And unlike earlier conquests, Genghis's orders during this campaign revealed an evolution in mindset. This was no longer simply about control, it was about example. Every refusal to surrender earned total annihilation. After Bukhara fell, Genghis reportedly stood in the city's grand mosque, where thousands of civilians had once worshipped, and declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Fear had now become a primary weapon, sharpened as cruelly as any sword or arrow. Cities that resisted were slaughtered to their last man. Engineers, nobles, and children alike. Rivers were choked with blood, and walls were torn down brick for brick. Survivors were sometimes spared, but only to carry the tale of terror to neighboring lands. This was warfare as theater, calculated trauma, meant not merely to win, but to break the will to ever resist again. And yet, behind the carnage, there was military engineering of genius. Genghis Khan's forces were not just ruthless, they were reinventing the art of siege. The Mongols had typically been nomadic cavalry, light armor, horseback archers. But here, facing walled cities and fortified architecture, they adapted fast. They captured Persian and Chinese engineers, forced them into service, built siege towers, trebuchets, collapsible bridges. Sometimes they dammed rivers to flood cities. Sometimes they filled moats with the dead. Whatever broke the wall was good enough. In one instance, when a city's well-fortified gates proved unbreachable with force, the Mongols tunneled under the walls, collapsing them from beneath. Siege warfare was no longer a weakness, it had become doctrine. As the Khwarezmian Empire crumbled city by city, it became clear that Genghis Khan's war machine was evolving into something far more terrifying than anyone in the Islamic or Christian world had ever faced. This wasn't just a swarm of horsemen, it was a disciplined, adaptive, coordinated juggernaut. Even after a city was taken, the Mongols would immediately secure the surrounding terrain, patrol major trade roads, and establish mobile outposts. Local governors were executed or, if compliant, temporarily reinstalled under Mongol supervision. Nothing was left to chance. The Mongols didn't just win battles. They vacuumed entire regions of resistance, sucking the soul from cities before moving to the next. Yet what made this campaign truly unprecedented wasn't just the destruction, it was the psychological footprint it left. Entire cities surrendered at the mere rumor of Mongol approach. Walls were torn down before the first scouts arrived. Sultans, once proud rulers of ancient dynasties, abandoned their thrones and fled into deserts in a panic. Even hardened generals wept when they saw the black banners of Genghis rising beyond the horizon. Fear had become contagious. It spread faster than any army and broke defenses well before the first arrow flew. In this wave of destruction, the Mongols refined a tactic that historians now call the surrender or die doctrine. Towns and villages were given a simple binary choice: open the gates and submit to Mongol rule, or resist and face complete liquidation. In many cases, choosing to submit didn't even cost the population their leaders or their religion. Local rulers who agreed to serve Genghis were often left in power, simply becoming vassals. But those who issued even a whisper of rebellion, those who so much as executed a scout or stalled a tax caravan, they were wiped off the maps, not punished, not conquered, erased. It was a form of spiritual warfare. It sent a single, unshakable message across continents. Genghis Khan does not forgive mistakes, not a miscalculated war, not an insult, and certainly not betrayal. The full might of this strategy emerged in the destruction of Nishapur. After initial Mongol control was established, an uprising emerged among its citizens, a fresh rebellion. Genghis wasn't present at the time. It was his son-in-law who led the suppression. He was killed in battle. That loss triggered not just a response, but a calculated extermination. Genghis returned and flattened the city. Tens of thousands, some say over 100,000, were slaughtered in revenge. Some sources claim that Genghis ordered the skulls of the dead to be built into pyramids to warn neighboring towns. No. Defiance would be forgotten, and no enemy would survive the second chance they were mistakenly given. Yet all of this, every siege, every execution, every flaming city, stemmed from one act: the killing of Genghis Khan's ambassadors. It raises the haunting question: was this vengeance or justice? Genghis would have said it was law, his law. A violation so great it demanded eternal consequence. But to the men, women, and children crushed beneath his retaliation, what was their crime? They hadn't murdered the envoys. They hadn't made policy. And yet they were consumed all the same, buried alive in the fallout of one empire's pride, clashing with another's wrath. The line between justice and domination blurred in blood. Yet, within the chaos, Genghis was still engineering control. After each conquest, he didn't vanish like a raider. He left behind administrators, tax agents, scholars, translators. He integrated Persian bureaucrats into his system, learning from them even as he ruled them. He spared craftsmen, poets, scribes, mathematicians, moving them across the empire to serve in his councils. His conquests weren't just erasures. They were also collections, a way to steal not just gold but genius. The Mongol Empire grew not only in size but in intelligence with every nation it swallowed. And the Khwarezmian campaign showed the world one brutal truth no one could ignore anymore. Genghis Khan was not a steppe bandit grown powerful. He was an empire in motion. The man who once outlasted exile, betrayal, starvation, and war now stood beneath skies he had ridden under as a boy. But age had changed him, not in body alone, but in thought. Genghis Khan, the scourge of empires, the cannon of the steppes, had begun to reflect not just on the battles he'd won, but on the world he fought so hard to change. The fires of conquest burned endlessly in youth, but now those flames flickered slower. Around him, suns were growing. Restless, generals began to whisper, and the old warrior, who had taught death to so many, began to feel the slow reach of something he'd never outmaneuver. Time. In his final years, the great Khan's mind turned inward. He began inviting holy men from every tradition: Islamic scholars, Taoist mystics, Buddhist monks, Christian clerics. Not to convert, but to listen. He would sit in open countryside, just him, his tent, and these voices of God, asking them about the nature of life, power, destiny. He asked what happened beyond death, what the heavens recorded, and whether his victories made him great, or merely a tool of a greater will. One Chinese Taoist wrote that Genghis once stared for hours at the stars in silence. When asked what he saw, he replied, "Only the fire I cannot command." At the height of his power, his empire stretched from the Sea of Japan to the Caspian coast. Cities he'd never visited sent taxes in his name. Tribes that had once mocked his family's fall now marched under his banner. And yet, even he began to see that conquest is not legacy. Land can be claimed, but hearts, unity, permanence, those are harder to hold. And within his own family, cracks had already begun to show. His sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui, were each respected, each capable, but also each ambitious. Jochi, born from Berte shortly after her kidnapping and rescue, always carried the silent question mark of legitimacy. Chagatai often clashed with him, refusing to acknowledge him as a possible heir. Ogedei, more diplomatic but less assertive. Tolui, the youngest, close to his father, but untested in statecraft. Genghis watched as decisions once made by blood, and brotherhood now balanced on inheritance and ideology. The iron discipline that held his armies together did not always hold his sons in check. One of the great Khan's private fears was that his empire, built not just with arrows but with laws, logistics, and vision, would dissolve into fragments after his death. Fragmentation was the curse of tribal culture, and despite all the systems he'd built, Genghis knew his grand structure was still young. Young roots do not hold tree trunks after storms. As campaigns against the Western Xia and Jin dynasties continued, more often as punitive raids than mass conquests, Genghis began journeying further into reflection. He demanded efficiency in all things, but more and more he seemed haunted by something deeper. Was the world truly better for what he had done? Had he forged peace, or only prolonged war on a larger scale? He began to ask advisors, what is a man who rules millions but cannot unify his house? But time had no patience, and fate no loyalty. In 1227, while on campaign in Western Xia, one of the last kingdoms resisting Mongol supremacy, something happened. What exactly remains a mystery to this day. Some accounts say he fell off his horse during a hunt and suffered internal injuries. Others suggest illness crept in, and some sources, perhaps shaded by fear or fiction, hint at darker ends, poisoning, or even assassination by palace insiders or captured enemies. The exact cause vanished into the dust of history, and just like that, the storm broke. Genghis Khan was dead. The man whose name had terrorized half the known world was gone, and yet, almost, no one knew. His death was kept secret for months. The army was still in the midst of a campaign, and if word got out, enemies might seize the moment. So his generals and sons held their silence, wrapped his body in secrecy, and returned to Mongolia in quiet urgency. The great Khan's passing became legend not for its grandeur, but for its absence. No public funeral, no monumental statements, just whispers across the world of a storm that had suddenly gone still. There are as many legends about his burial as there were battles in his lifetime. Some claimed that the soldiers escorting his body to its final resting place killed every living witness along the way, to protect the secrecy of the tomb. Then, those escorting soldiers were themselves killed. Another version says a river was diverted over his grave to make it unfindable. Others speak of eternal curses for anyone who dares to search for the tomb. To this day, no one has found it, making it perhaps the most elusive and enigmatic burial in history. A man whose existence was marked by power and presence had, in death, become invisible. But regardless of where his bones lay, the questions he left behind lingered. What does it mean to build an empire that stretches farther than Alexander's, than Rome's, than even China's, and still fear for its future? What is a lifetime of conquest if the next generation tears it apart through rivalry, arrogance, or indecision? Before his death, Genghis had named Ogedei as his successor. It shocked many. Yochi was the eldest. Chagatai was the most aggressive. Tolui closest to his father in spirit. But Genghis knew Ogedei's gift. He was patient, diplomatic, a consensus builder. Perhaps that's what the empire would need after a lifetime of fire. Even so, tensions remained. Chagatai still resented Yochi. Tolui wanted power. And the sons of some of Genghis's famed generals were now rising in ambition. The law could name heirs, but it couldn't kill ambition. And so, though the Mongol Empire continued to conquer, stretching into Russia, the Middle East, even threatening parts of Europe, the seeds of internal decay had already been sown. Within 60 years of Genghis's death, the empire began to fracture into the Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and of course the Yuan dynasty in China, founded by his grandson Kublai Khan. Each piece claimed to be Mongol. Each piece was a fragment of the man, and yet perhaps this was always the fate of empire. Even Rome turned to dust. Even the pharaohs sleep beneath sand. But Genghis Khan had hoped for more. Not stones, not statues, but longevity of order, of system, of legacy that could outlast ambition. In moments of quiet, if he had any, did he wonder whether he had succeeded? The warrior who once rode across frozen rivers and burning deserts now lived only in stories, some told by trembling villagers, others whispered proudly by his descendants. But history asks a cruel question. Did he build a dynasty or merely ignite a moment? His people had once been outcasts, scattered across steppes without unity, without a flag. Under him, they became rulers of the world. But empires are not merely measured by the lands they claim. They are measured by what they leave behind. Genghis Khan left behind a mixed inheritance, a legacy wrapped in brilliance and brutality, innovation and annihilation. To many he was a devil on horseback. To others, a lawgiver who brought peace beneath the shadow of the sword. Both images are true, and perhaps neither is complete. One thing history never denies is his transformation, from a starving boy abandoned by his tribe, to a warlord, to a world builder. He rose not by luck or divine right, but by will, by vision, and by a refusal to accept the role that fate had written for him. And even as his empire eventually splintered, his ideas lived on. His code, his military structure, his obsession with order over chaos. His ability to inspire loyalty from the lowest of men and terror from kings. These are the fingerprints that history still studies. In the end, death conquered the unconquerable. The man who once declared, "I am the punishment of God," was punished not by a rival army, but by life itself. Mortality came for him not with banners or swords, but in silence, just as it comes for all men. And as time buried his body in an unmarked grave, it also began the slow burial of his empire, not all at once, but piece by piece, inheritance by inheritance, betrayal by betrayal, until all that was left was legend. Genghis Khan vanished from the world in silence, buried in secrecy, without monument or mausoleum. And yet, for a man whose body disappeared into the earth, his shadow stretched farther than any ruler before him. In the years following his death, the empire he built did not slow, it accelerated. His sons and grandsons, inheriting both the sword and the system, expanded Mongol territory beyond even Genghis's imagination. Entire nations fell into the hands of his lineage. Under Ogedei, the Mongols swept into Russia, devastated Poland, and stood at the doorstep of Western Europe. It was not a myth, it was reality. The Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous empire in recorded human history, spanning over 12 million square miles. While other empires rose slowly over centuries, Genghis's storm built its reach in decades. No single ruler has ever changed the political map of the world so quickly. And yet, conquest was only one layer of impact. Mongol expansion reshaped the arteries of civilization itself. Trade routes that had withered under constant war and banditry were reborn. Genghis Khan's successors secured the Silk Road like no power before them. Caravans moved freely across thousands of miles of Mongol-controlled territory, from China to the Middle East, and even into Europe. Merchants, diplomats, missionaries, scribes, all found that the Mongol Empire, though ruthless in war, was oddly efficient in bureaucracy. Under the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, ideas flowed as fluidly as spices and gold. Chinese gunpowder traveled west. European glasswork reached the east, laws spread, languages evolved, cultures collided and blended. And for a brief, fragile time in the 13th and 14th centuries, the world felt smaller than ever before. But there was a darker price for this interconnectivity. The same trade routes that brought wealth and culture also carried death. In the mid-1300s, rats bearing infected fleas traveled with caravans from Asia into Europe, and with them came the most feared disease in history, the Black Death. The plague spread with terrifying speed across the pathways that Genghis's empire had safeguarded. Within years, tens of millions were dead. Some blamed the Mongols directly, citing the siege of Kaffa, where plague-ridden corpses were hurled over city walls, an early form of biological warfare. Whether accidental or intentional, the Mongol revival of global trade had created not just an empire, but a network, one that was both a lifeline and a noose. This contradiction lies at the heart of Genghis Khan's legacy. On one hand, his name is attached to slaughter on a biblical scale, entire populations erased, cities depopulated, libraries burned to ash. And yet, in the very next breath, he is credited for forging an age of tolerance, mobility, and progress. He protected all religions but punished all resistance. He killed without hesitation, but allowed scientists, artists, and tradespeople to flourish under his law. Was he a visionary, or a tyrant, a unifier, or a destroyer? The answer refuses to be simple. Modern perspectives on Genghis Khan echo this duality. In the West, especially in Europe and parts of the Middle East, his name remains synonymous with terror, barbarian invasions, brutality, ruin. But in Mongolia, he is still celebrated as a national hero. His face appears on currency, his statue towers on highways, and his stories are told with pride. Schools teach his wisdom. Scholars debate his genius. He is remembered not merely as a conqueror, but as a father of identity, the man who gave Mongols a shared name and purpose. For a people who had once been scattered, betrayed, and forgotten, Genghis became a shape of permanence. And then there's the legacy written into flesh. In 2003, a groundbreaking genetic study revealed that nearly 1 in every 200 men alive today, over 16 million men, may be directly descended from Genghis Khan. The research tracked a rare genetic marker on the Y chromosome, commonly found across large regions of Asia from Siberia to northern India. This didn't happen by accident. It was the result of cultural custom and absolute power. Genghis, and later his descendants, fathered many children, through marriage, alliance, and all, too often conquest. The royal bloodline was sacred, and in many regions of the empire, having Mongol ancestry guaranteed privilege. Over generations, that blood spread like the empire itself, quiet, invisible, yet still pulsing in millions of bodies across the world. Genghis Khan's legacy cannot be measured in borders alone. It must be read through the fragile lines of culture, memory, and contradiction. The same hand that wiped dynasties from the earth also extended protections to artists, merchants, and monks. His name became both a curse and a legend. Some painted him as a demon on horseback, others as the architect of the modern world. But perhaps the strangest part of Genghis Khan's story is this. For all the destruction he left behind, he left. No palace, no towering temple, not even a known tomb. His empire built no great marble edifice to celebrate his reign. His memory, unlike the pharaohs or the emperors of Rome, rests not in stone, but in systems, in roads, in laws, in echoes. And yet somehow he is still one of the most remembered humans in history. Entire volumes have been written, paintings imagined, films made. His name remains universally recognizable, whispered with awe or dread on nearly every continent. Perhaps that's the ultimate irony. The man who tried to conquer death by seizing the world found immortality not in monuments, but in the minds of those who feared, resisted, or followed him. History has tried time and again to define Genghis Khan in a single word: tyrant, hero, madman, visionary. But no single word can carry the weight of what he truly became. He shattered civilizations, yet structured one of his own. He was hated as a barbarian, yet respected by scholars. He defended law while destroying cities. He promoted technology while punishing dissent. His identity, just like his empire, defies borders. He was everything the world needed in a leader, and everything it feared. Some historians argue that Genghis Khan's rise was a product of timing, a broken political landscape, divided enemies, tribal instability. But even in the vacuum of power, few could have filled it the way he did. It wasn't merely conquest, it was calculation, charisma, ruthless clarity, a code enforced by fear, but held together by reason. Without Genghis, there would be no Mongol Empire. Without the Mongol Empire, the spread of ideas, technologies, and trade routes that underpinned the modern age might have taken centuries longer. You can hate the storm, yes. But what if the forest that grew after it depended on it? To truly understand his legacy, we must return to that philosophical question that hangs over every story of conquest. Does history reward those who conquer or those who write? Because Genghis Khan did both. He didn't write books, but he rewrote maps. He didn't draft poetry, but he crafted law. He didn't sculpt statues, but he shaped systems so effective they echoed into eras untouched by his hand. And most importantly, he controlled the narrative through actions so loud, none could ignore them. Western chroniclers, Arab historians, Persian poets, and Chinese scribes all recorded his name. None could silence him. Even death failed in that task, and so we are left with the shadow of a man erased from his own grave, yet branded into history like fire into flesh. His presence lingers in every classroom that teaches strategy, every museum that displays medieval cartography, and every modern leader that dreams of unifying divided lands. Somewhere across the sweeping plains of Mongolia, beneath sky and silence, his bones likely rest. But Genghis Khan, the legend, the storm, the paradox, never truly rested. He continues to conquer, through memory, through bloodlines, through the very structure of the world we walk today. The silence of his tomb is not the end of his story. It is the beginning of his myth. And in that myth lies power no arrow or sword could ever match. Legacy, after all, is not built on what you take. It's built on what remains when you're gone. He ruled over the greatest empire the world had ever seen. He turned horses and arrows into instruments of reshaping civilization. He built a code of law so efficient it outlived kingdoms. And when Genghis Khan died in 1227, as quietly as a shadow slipping into dusk, he left behind no monument, no mausoleum, no pyramid or palace, no world-altering announcement or ceremonial grief carved in stone. Instead, he disappeared, truly disappeared. For nearly 800 years, historians, archaeologists, explorers, and empires have searched for his final resting place. They have traced old maps, scanned mountains, questioned ancient texts, tapped satellites and excavated hills, but they have never found him, and by some accounts they never will, because his death may have been history's greatest vanishing act, one last move of power, controlled entirely by the man who never allowed the world to control him. The legends surrounding the burial of Genghis Khan are not only chilling, they are deliberately mythic. According to the accounts passed down through generations, when the great Khan died during the campaign against Western Sia, his body was carried back to Mongolia under the highest secrecy. Not even most of his army was told. His death would not be revealed until the empire was stabilized. Once the convoy arrived in Mongolia, the true ritual began. His most trusted men, possibly numbering in the hundreds or more, were charged with digging his tomb in the wild, remote regions, most likely in the Khenti Mountains where he was born. But this was no ordinary burial. To keep the grave's location secret, the men are said to have killed every bystander they encountered along the journey. Travelers, hunters, herdsmen, anyone who might remember the path, anyone who could tell the tale. All silenced. Then, in a final wave of silence, those very soldiers were themselves executed. Another group killed them and were in turn killed. Our chain of silence sealed with loyalties greater than fear, ensuring that not one man would live to whisper where the world's most feared leader was laid to rest. Some stories claim an entire army diverted a river to flow over his tomb, hiding it under water and rock. Others say forests were planted over the site. Some say horses trampled the ground until no trace of a grave remained. The silence was total, and to this day it remains unbroken. But why? Why would a man who conquered so much erase himself from the world when he had every right to dominate it even in death? The answer may not be practical. It may be philosophical. Genghis Khan, for all his brutality, understood the weight of perception. His entire empire was engineered on myth as much as metal. He used fear not just in war but in storytelling. The unknown terrified more deeply than anything seen, and in disappearing, in becoming legend rather than digging a monument into the earth, he became untouchable. He eliminated the grave as a place of weakness, avoided a shrine vulnerable to vandalism or theft, avoided relics that would fall into the hands of rivals. In death, the most powerful man in the world made himself immortal by doing the one thing no conqueror had ever done. He left nothing behind. And yet in doing so, he left everything. Over the centuries, rulers built tombs taller than cities, yet time stole them all. Grave robbers, weather enemies, and revolutionaries broke open chambers of gold and glory, turning legacies into dust. But Genghis Khan still lies in secret, untouched, unclaimed. The world knows of his wars, debates his morals, studies his code, even tracks his bloodline, but they do not stand over his bones. And perhaps that's exactly what he intended. The mystery of his resting place has become a testament to his myth, a final warning to the living, that not all power must be flaunted, and not all silence is weakness. Searches have continued to this day. In recent decades, satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and LiDAR scans have revealed promising sites in the Mongolian countryside. Burial mounds, anomalies in terrain, subsurface structures that suggest ancient man-made formations. But then come the deeper questions. If the tomb were found, would it be opened? Should it? Mongolian tradition still holds Genghis Khan as sacred. Disturbing his grave would be an act of heresy to some, a crime to others. It would violate the very legacy he fought to protect. Many believe his tomb was meant not just to house his body, but to remain unfound, forever guarding the silence he commanded in both life and death. And in this silence emerges a haunting question. Is true immortality achieved through terror, reverence, or simply being remembered? Genghis did not outlive time through temples or titles. He embedded himself in systems, in fear, in admiration. While kings erected grand tombs and were forgotten, Genghis vanished and became eternal. He is taught in history classes across the globe, analyzed by military strategists, debated by ethicists, idolized by some, vilified by others. One man born into abandonment, with no castle, no wealth, no army, rose to command one of the most feared and efficient powers known to humanity. And in the end, he ensured that even the final chapter of his story remained his to write. In that unmarked soil, somewhere between legend and landscape, lies more than just a man. It is the grave of dominance, of myth-making, of the belief that power, if wielded with precision and fearlessness, can echo long after the sword is buried. Genghis Khan taught the world how to wage war, but in death, he taught it how to maintain power without presence. Because while his empire fractured, and his line faded, and the world moved on, the question of his tomb has never been buried.